Now let's talk about assessment data at the school and district level. I have included links in this module to the ESSA accountability data for the state of Delaware for you to look at and see how the assessment data is accumulated and interpreted. Of course, we know that newcomer ELLs are only given 1 year, a 1-year exemption for the reading standardized testing, and no exemption at all for the other content standardized tests that are administered each year. We can discuss later on in this presentation what the issues are around that and how we can better articulate them. But the main thing to know here is to know exactly who the newcomers are. They need to be recently arrived from another country, not from another state, and have been in this country less than 12 months. But one thing to note about the results of these scores is that it is not necessarily required that the scores of the newcomers' standardized tests be included in the accountability data for the schools or the districts in that first year. So you should probably ask and check and see whether or not those first year assessments for math and science and social studies are included in your school's data or not. Another thing to be aware of is when English language learners exit their service programs and become former ELLs, their standardized test data should still continue to be included in the ELL subgroup for an additional 2 years during their monitoring period. Let's talk about the rationale behind that inclusion of former ELLs in the ELL subgroup after they leave the identification subgroup. Let's think about the larger picture. Who exactly is an English language learner? Okay. And why, how does decisions made about what scores get included into the ELL subgroup and what scores do not? What scores go into the main student subgroup? One way to look at this is the apparent misconception about ELL-ness. Sometimes we forget that that limited English proficiency is not a fixed trait. It is more an incremental efficacy reality. What that means is these students are not going to be limited English proficient on a permanent basis. Sometimes we conflate the two key subgroups that we're always addressing, the ELLs and the LDs, the Spec Ed subgroup, whose traits tend to have a more permanent or long-term quality for various reasons. But unless an English language learner also has a specific learning disability, that student should be progressing out of the ELL subgroup over a period of 2 to 3 years, ideally, depending on when they arrive. Especially if they're elementary level students, the typical period where the student requires English language support is about 3-4 years maximum. If they arrive later, they often need a lot more time. So how does that fact get interpreted on a high-stakes test, on high-stakes test results? So we're going to take a look at some graphs from another school area in California where a group did some in-depth research about how students are identified and viewed in terms of their learning progress and how schools are held accountable for them. So the WestEd research group identified three main subgroups of linguistically diverse students. The one that we are most familiar with is the blue group here, the one that's in between, the current English language learners, the ones that we identify. And within that group is the long-term ELLs, the ones that are taking a lot longer than the usual 3 to 4 year period to exit out of services for various reasons. But one group that we do not specifically think about is the larger group, all the students who not only are ELLs now, but who ever were ELLs. Consider that. We have a large number of English language learners, and where are they once they are no longer receiving services? So they get reclassified, and then they become part of the larger main group included in the native English speaking student group. Let's consider whether that is really an accurate identification for this particular student population. It's a valid question to bring up whenever we talk about interpreting performance data. So this is a longitudinal bar graph of several pictures of the same cohort, beginning from kindergarten through 5th grade in a Northern California school district that shows their language development growth. So the WestEd Research Group took a group of 673 kindergartners and tracked them for 5 years to see whether they met language proficiency and when. And as you can see, the colors identify the different language levels, the brightest red being a level 1 beginning, and the green actually being reclassified as English proficient. So that's actually level 6. So you can see this is a fairly normal trajectory for English language learners. If they all begin at some lower level of proficiency in kindergarten, by grade 5, you have a large percentage of them exited out for a number of years, with a very, very small percentage of that same cohort still remaining as requiring services. But the thing to consider is all of these students are still in school. These students that are now reclassified as English proficient are now considered native English speakers. Is that actually the case, though? Are they, if we took a closer look at their academic data, would there still be some language-related needs because of home language interference or what have you? This graph from the Northern California district is not a longitudinal graph. It's actually a snapshot of 12 different grades and the ratios of the different level proficiencies of the different groups. But one thing that this research group did, which most districts and states do not do, is they continued to keep track of all the students who ever were English language learners. So for example, if you look in kindergarten, you see they're all going to be current English language learners. There would not be any long-term ELLs, and there would be no reclassified English proficient former ELLs either. But as you look at each grade, you can see that the the constituents evolve. By grade 5, you will begin to see some long-term ELLs. If they've been in kindergarten and they're still requiring services by grade 5, then these would be considered long-term ELLs. But as you can see, by grade 2, you have a lot of students who are now exiting, and that cohort increases with each grade. So the interesting thing is, though, that most districts only look at the blue and the red. And we will note when we look at our Delaware data that we have a large number of English language learners in elementary school, and suddenly we only have 10% or very small percentage of English language learners in middle school and high school. Well, where did they all go? They're all in the green group, okay? Are we still looking at those students? Do they still need services? Are they meeting the goals, and do they still need some degree of language support in order to master their academic content? Here is the most interesting graph from this California school district. This is actual performance data for various subgroups. So, for example, the red line here is the current English language learner subgroup. And as you can see, this is the very typical pattern that as we move up into the higher grades, there becomes a wider and wider performance gap between the ELL group and the group which is the native English speakers, which is the blue line, the English only group, okay? This is the gap that we always see in our state accountability data. But now let's take another look. This research group took a look at all of the students who ever were ELLs and are now reclassified as English proficient. That's the green line up here. These are former ELLs. In other words, their English is not their first language, but they are considered now English proficient. In other words, they received a 5 on the access score. In this particular school district, they are actually outperforming the native English speakers, okay? The purple line is the combined line between the current English language learners and all those students who ever were English language learners. The purple line looks more like the true gap, okay? So what we are looking at in the red line is a continuing influx of newcomers. How can we ever close that gap when it is always a new group? A more stable group to compare for accountability purposes is all the students that we have ever served in our English language services. So this is an excerpt from a PDF that I have posted in Module 10. This is actually State of Delaware 2017 demographic data for English language learners. For 2017, it appears that 8% on average of our total student population are English language learners. This is actually an average of a very wide range. We have as little as 3% in some school districts and as much as 17 or 18% in other school districts. But once again, this data is only looking at English language learners who are currently receiving services. If you take a look at the square down here to the right, you can see 78% of those students are in elementary school, and only 10% and 12% are in high school. This raises a question for me. Where are all the students? when they leave elementary school, moving into high school? Well, presumably they have, one of two things have happened. They have either moved out of the state or they have exited services, but they are still in school. Are we still tracking them? Are teachers and schools and educators receiving equitable credit for their success? Because remember, once they leave the ELL subgroup, they are no longer counted in terms of ELL accountability. And so it's a bit ironic because those are the students who have received the most benefit from our extra support in language support, so much so that they have then exited out of the identifiable subgroup for which we are being held accountable. So this is a pretty critical question that I believe often needs to be reviewed and brought up occasionally to make sure that we are viewing our data in a realistic way. So let's take another look at the questions about assessment data and how we interpret it and use it. As we know, the performance gap between the general population and the ELL subgroup is usually pretty large. Can we articulate why this is? Does it have to do with the actual ELL student performance or how we correlate and combine the performance data? Are we including the students that we really mean to include? Is the compilation of the data valid? Are the administration decisions research-based about when to require students to take the test, and which student performance assessments are the ones that we should be held accountable for? Remember that we know from our past learning in MA TESOL courses that it takes as long as 7 to 10 years for students to become proficient in academic language, okay, in their CALPs. And does that is that actually considered in the decisions that we make about when ELLs are required to submit to standardized testing? And then an even more basic question is the ELL subgroup. As we have just seen, the ELL subgroup, the group that is receiving services, changes from year to year. It's an unstable group. They are always going to be lower proficiency students and will always receive lower scores. As soon as they are able to receive higher scores, they exit out of that identification subgroup. And so how does that impact our accountability measures as teachers, as schools, as school districts, and at the state level? Okay, so recommendations to keep non-native English-speaking students in a subgroup for longer term tracking. Maybe they are receiving services, but maybe we need to actually identify them not as English language learners, but just non-native English speakers. This might be a more transparent and more true picture of our student population. Consider that currently we are identifying an average of 8% across all school districts as English language learners. But once again, we are not including all of those students who have exited. And if you look at the graphs for the California School District, you will note that it's probably twice as many former ELLs as current ELLs. And if you put all of those students together, we could have as many as 25% of our students as non-native English speakers. So with that in mind, we need to be sure that we are that we have evidence that the goals that we set for ourselves in accountability measures are actually attainable, okay, with accurate data. And of course, as we have been discussing throughout our course here, have we provided appropriate accommodations and supports in the higher stakes test so that our ELLs can show everything that they can do? This slide is a quick review of things we have already discussed in Module 4 when we first explored standardized testing. Obviously, we want to have our high-stakes tests align as closely as we can with taught curriculum without actually teaching to the test. Choosing appropriate supports and accommodations that meet the needs of our students, and make sure that our students are using those supports and accommodations throughout their learning environment, not just during the state tests. And as was mentioned in Module 4, there are documents now in place called crosswalk documents that can show how to incorporate those particular accommodations and supports in your curriculum. Obviously providing sufficient training on computer-based assessments, but perhaps incorporating computer work in your alternative assessment so that students are familiar with using computers and their interface. Teaching and practicing the test language and formats. This is all about academic language anyway, and the information in Module 6 about explicit vocabulary instruction will go a long way to supporting how to interpret the language of a test, and teaching appropriate test-taking strategies. Multiple choice test-taking strategies are obviously key, and then, as always, using your English proficiency scores to plan effective instruction. Okay, once you complete Module 10 and submit the final version of your assessment design project, there will be just a few wrap-up things for you to do. If you have not already done it, please complete the online course feedback survey. The UD course evaluation will also be open for a 7-day period. And I've also made an effort to combine all of the resources from the various modules into one place here in the wrap-up module. Of course, you are welcome to peruse the entire Canvas course at your leisure to download any discussions that you might want to save to use as reflections for your portfolios that you will need, particularly if you are an MA TESOL candidate. You will need to provide learning artifacts and also reflections about those artifacts in your 18-credit portfolio. And information about that is linked in the wrap-up module. Okay, and then you will be finished. Congratulations.